Hey, how's it going, everybody? So eventually I'm going to do a more sciencey video trying to compare the Future Shock system to the Redshift Sports ShockStop Stem using a vibrational data logger and some data analysis. Now, I'm really not sure how that's going to go yet, but that's the plan anyways. But today I just wanted to get my general thoughts on these two suspension systems in video form before I really dive into the nerdy stuff. Now, you might be wondering why I'm walking rather than riding my bike. Well, it's because I came out to do this video shoot and I flatted, and I don't have the luxury of time to just do it on another day. So it's going to be a hiking video today. At least we're still outside though. So I feel like in 2022, most people have adopted the notion that smoother is faster. I think that's why companies are starting to incorporate wonky and really proprietary suspension designs into their bikes. And I think it's a big reason why large volume tires have really exploded in popularity. Partly because they're more comfortable almost in any scenario, but also that the science is showing us that there's basically no overall speed penalty by going wider with lower pressures. Now, the thought is that while aerodynamic and hysteretic losses increase, those losses are overshadowed by the reduction in suspension losses, or what some refer to as impedance losses. Now, basically, unless you're riding perfectly smooth tarmac, you're almost always better off going with a wider, squishier tire. Anyway, so the Future Shock is specialized proprietary front suspension system and offers 20 millimeters of compliance in the front end. It's highly, well, specialized, and bikes that have it can't really remove it, and bikes without it can't simply add it. Now, the Redshift ShockStop Stem, on the other hand, aims to do a similar thing, but does so in a much different way using elastomers and a pivoting mechanism to offer roughly the same amount of compliance, but in a product that can easily be swapped from bike to bike. So this here is the Pro model ShockStop stem, which is Redshift's flagship model, and this 80 millimeter stem comes in at about 220 grams, and it has this nice two-tone black finish to it. Now, to be clear, it installs exactly the same way as any other standard threadless stem on the market, and there's a bunch of different elastomers that come with it, so you can actually mix and match to get even more total configurations, so you can really fine-tune the feel. Now, you might be wondering why there aren't any direct comparisons between these two systems, and it's precisely because you can't remove the Future Shock system and install the ShockStop stem on a typical Future Shock equipped bike. So what makes this video a little bit different is that on this particular Diverge, we have a prototype of an engineered and machined Future Shock Delete, which I have a whole nother video about. You can check it out down in the link below. But basically, it's allowing me to totally replace the Future Shock system with a rigid front end, and then I've installed the Redshift ShockStop stem on that. So yeah, you're basically looking at what I believe is the first Future Shock equipped bike with the option to run only the Redshift ShockStop stem and no Future Shock. Something about that seems really backwards now that I say it out loud, but whatever, we're doing it for science. Now, I've been on the Future Shock for a couple of years now, so I have a really good sense for how it rides, but I've only got a few dozen miles on the ShockStop stem so far, but I can clearly feel the difference, and I'll try and explain it sort of qualitatively since I don't have any actual data yet. So first off, the ShockStop stem feels like a piece of flexible material. It's a pretty narrow subset of you that might understand this, but it's like if you've ever flexed a hockey stick by pushing it down on the ground to get a sense for how it'll play. Or maybe a more relatable example is walking to the edge of a springy diving board and having it flex under your feet. The point is, it's a very progressive spring rate. Now, this is likely because there are elastomers rather than an actual coil spring to absorb the energy. Now, because of this, it never really feels like it bottoms out, which is kind of nice. It generally feels more like just like a really flexible extension of the bike. But critically, it's only flexible in one degree of freedom, which is rotation about, we'll call it the handlebar axis, or in other words, the forward and backward pitch angle. Now, if you're curious, there's no discernible yaw or roll deflection, which I think is a pretty key design element in this particular product. Now, on the other hand, the Future Shock actually feels like a shock, like you might find on a mountain bike's telescoping front fork. Now, you can really feel the translation up and down, and the spring rate feels more linear, again, like when you compress a front shock on a mountain bike. Now, in my experience, you can definitely bottom out the Future Shock, and I'd go as far as to say it's actually pretty common down chunky trails. Now, aside from the fact that the Future Shock uses an actual coil spring and the ShockStop uses elastomers, the other major difference is that the Redshift stem rotates while the Future Shock translates. Now, this means that on the Redshift, you actually get more travel the further you are radially from the pivot point. Actually, technically, it means that it responds to an applied torque, meaning the direction of the force and the distance from the pivot point both play a role. Now, for instance, assuming that the force on the handlebar is nearly vertical, that means that it'll get much more travel on the hoods than when you're in the drops. In fact, at the extreme, it also means that you'll get virtually zero travel at the tips of the drops, since the force vector and the moment arm are collinear, meaning that the cross product and hence the applied torque are equal to zero. So basically all this to say, you're going to get more travel on the Redshift stem when you're in the hoods than when you're in the drops. Now, by contrast, no matter where you hold the bars on the Future Shock system, drops, hoods, or tops, they'll all actuate proportional to the applied force. Do I have a preference? It's hard to say. They both claim about 20 millimeters of axial compliance, but the experiences are actually really different. I will say that I can definitely feel the rotation while I'm riding in the hoods on the ShockStop stem, which does take a bit of time to get used to. It kind of feels like you're getting thrown forward a little bit, since they're rotating forward ever so slightly. Now, it's definitely less of an issue when you're descending in the hoods and you're more over the tops of the bars. Now, the next point that I'll make is that the Future Shock does feel a bit more active, like a coil spring on a mountain bike. Again, probably because it's literally a coil spring. Now, interestingly, neither system makes the bars feel floaty or disconnected from the bike, which is good. Now, I kind of expected the Future Shock system to feel a little bit more disconnected from the bike than the ShockStop, since the bars in the stem actually translate up and down, but I didn't really feel that either system was actually better or worse in this category, and you can definitely get used to either. Now, as far as the actual damping properties, both systems seem to do a pretty good job of absorbing the low amplitude, high frequency chatter that's pretty typical on trails. And I will say that both actually feel pretty good when things get bumpy. Now, of course, neither system is meant to absorb big hits, but rather they're designed to just sort of take the edge off that relentless gravel rumble that has a tendency to fatigue the body over time. Okay, so I realized I kind of dodged the question earlier. Do I have a preference? Well, you know, it's really hard to say, but if I had to pick one that I prefer to ride, I think it might be the Future Shock if we're talking pure ride feel. I just think that it tends to smooth out the rumbly stuff a touch better, and I think it has a slightly better feel at the handlebars. But there are a couple of major caveats that I think make it a little bit less clear as to which is, quote, better. Now, first of all, the Future Shock is super proprietary. In fact, unless you already own a specialized bike equipped with the Future Shock system, there's really not that much to consider, since it's flat out not an option to have a Future Shock stem installed on a standard bike. It's almost like, well, it's almost like this video is kind of pointless, since ultimately you can't choose between the two systems. In other words, if your bike has Future Shock, then that's it, you have Future Shock. And by the way, adding a ShockStop stem onto a bike that already has a Future Shock, well, that's just a bad idea. You might think you're gonna get sort of double the effect, but it's basically just a series spring system, and basic physics says that the overall effective spring rate goes as the inverse of the sum of the reciprocals. So basically, you're just going to end up with a super soft, noodly front end that'll probably feel pretty disconnected from the bike. Actually, now that I think of it, this might be a fun video to make. But for now, I'm not recommending that you use both systems on the same bike. Now, again, one of the things I really like about the Redshift stem is that it pretty much plays well with any bike with the standard fork and headset system. And again, you could easily move it from bike to bike and remove it anytime you don't want suspension. I think actually the Redshift system will also save you a bunch of weight overall, since you don't have to factor in the few hundred grams extra associated with the Future Shock cartridge. So yeah, basically there's no answer as to which system is better. The ShockStop stem feels different than the Future Shock, but effectively it still offers the same amount of compliance in the front end. That is, if you're on the hoods. Again, as you shorten the moment arm by riding in the drops, the applied torque on the ShockStop stem shrinks pretty quickly, and at some point you'll actually get no compliance, which of course is not an issue with the Future Shock system. All right, so to summarize this rambling thesis, I think both systems are pretty good in reducing the vibrational energy transferred to the rider, but of course they do so in different ways, and they feel really different at the handlebars. Neither system outperforms the other per se, but I do give the Future Shock the edge in terms of pure ride feel, as it does feel a little bit more active, but the Future Shock does also come with some pretty considerable drawbacks, including the added weight and the fact that the Future Shock is pretty proprietary. It may not be very future proof. Stupid. Now, ultimately, for any given bike, you can't really choose between the two suspension systems unless you're like me and you happen to have a custom-made Future Shock Delete. So I'd say these aren't even really competing products. Now, to that end, if you don't have a specialized bike equipped with the Future Shock system, the Redshift ShockStop stem will definitely give you a similar result, and it'll certainly smooth out rough roads, but without the added complexity and additional weight associated with the FutureShock system. Okay, well, I think that's going to wrap it up. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I am planning a much more nerdy take on the FutureShock versus the ShockStop Stem, so be on the lookout for that if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and thanks again for subscribing if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.